Start the recording. Welcome everybody to the beginning of our spring term at Radical Anthropology in a rather empty, some very brave people who've made their way through the UCL archaeology department up and down the stairs to get into the UCL Anthro department. We're hoping there might be a few more people going to come, but we've got a good audience on Zoom, so we'd rather stay on time. And rather than Chris is going to give a little intro for me, and I'm going to do the talk. So Chris is going to say something about.
Yeah, okay, so yes, welcome everyone to this spring term's session of Radical Anthropology. Traditionally, this term is focusing on mythology, and there will be quite a bit of mythology to come. But this evening we have Dr. Camilla Power, and I'd simply say that, that she's unusual as an anthropologist because she was trained here at UCL under Professor Leslie Aiello many years ago in biological anthropology and paleoanthropology. But her fieldwork was done among the Hadza in Tanzania. And so what's unusual about Camilla is that she is equally competent with a biological and paleoanthropological, as well as social and cultural anthropology, which is actually very unusual. Almost everywhere you go, you'll find anthropologists are sort of stuck in one segment of what it means to be human, and and really pretty unfamiliar with anything else. So that's particularly relevant if we're looking at the book we're going to be discussing this evening. So just to say, all of us in the Radical Anthropology group were thrilled, delighted with the fact that a book had appeared, very well reviewed, selling well, which for the first time really put something like actually the topic of Friedrich Engels writing a long time ago in the 1890s, when Engels himself wrote a book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. And I should perhaps say that that's where I started. That was an extraordinary experience reading that book when I was in my teens, late teens. Really, a work of such scope, looking at everything which makes us human, and then trying to work out how it was that we became human, given that we're now all, one way or another, Darwinians. How do we get from being some kind of chimpanzee to being these incredible creatures that we are today, with language and with kinship and all the rest of it? So the dawn of everything has opened the door once again to that enormously brilliant, wide topic. And I just will say that we like a lot of the book. All of us were very happy with the tone of the book in so many ways, and with its iconoclasm, with the fact that it was throwing open new ideas and thinking everything again. But it has to be said that the authors are. Has to be said that we've got some more people. The masses are arriving. Okay. Fantastic. So it has to be said that this particular book, well, I wrote some reviews of it, and one of the reviews was called The Tea Time of Everything. This particular book, for some reason, puts the dawn of everything about 40,000 years ago in Europe, when we in RAG, and particularly our colleague Ian Watts, have been demonstrating that actually everything which makes us human, including human symbolic culture and art, emerged in Africa about 4 or 5 times earlier than the European Upper Paleolithic. And so that's, for a start, that's a strange idea that these authors have got, that somehow the dawn of everything was so. It's almost as if they're saying, yes, we evolved in Africa, but we didn't get smart till we hit Europe a mere 40,000 years ago. So that's a critical problem we have with the book. But there are many other problems. One of them being that, again, I mean, David Graeber was a great friend of ours, a great activist friend. We did all kinds of things together. But for some unearthly reason, David feels that the idea that we were once egalitarian, the idea that we once lived a communistic lifestyle, is itself a dangerous myth. And instead of that, we have the idea that hunter-gatherers are no more likely to be communistic or egalitarian than cattle owners, farmers, city dwellers, or anybody else. And in fact, early hunter-gatherers, what they're arguing is it would have been rather boring and restricted if hunter-gatherers were restricted to egalitarianism. How much more exciting and interesting it would have been if they'd been able to be creative and imaginative and adopt egalitarianism for one period and then get bored with it and then have a bit of despotism and then go back to some other system. And we really find that quite puzzling. And Camilla's going to be explaining why it is that actually modern science, quite a lot of modern science, we would probably say most paleoanthropology now agrees that there's something about immediate return hunter-gatherers, something about the kind of social structure that characterized our ancestors as we were developing language and so on, which was primarily and consistently and for good reasons egalitarianism. It wasn't just a choice that they made now and again and they went back to something else. There were reasons why only an egalitarian lifestyle could have driven the emergence of our strange species with our particular form of awareness and language and the rest of it. And Camilla is going to explain.
Okay. So, thanks for that, Chris. Am I okay? I'm sort of shadow and shade here. Thanks for that, Chris, because I'm assuming people who come tonight kind of have an awareness of who Graeber and Wengrow are, what the dawn of everything as a book is. As he says, as Chris has just said, dawn of everything kind of threw open a door, fantastic breath of fresh air, of being able to bring social anthropology to bear and thinking about the archaeology of human origins and the archaeology of sort of early prehistory, all of that fantastic. It is it's a book that's aimed to general audience, not to specialists, which is all fantastic because radical anthropology has always wanted to reach very general audience. That's always been our watchword too. And it's a book that's kind of all things for all people. Somehow, whatever you want to find in it, you can find in it. It's got such a sort of rich variety. But I am going to take them to task today for this quite vehement, it's extraordinary vehement attack on the notion that egalitarianism made us human, because I think there are absolutely powerful scientific grounds that that is the case. And we simply wouldn't be here today as language speaking, symbolic, all singing, all dancing human beings. We wouldn't be here today without a serious, protracted episode of egalitarianism through our ancestry. So what they say, Graeber and Wengrow, they talk about the world of hunter-gatherers before the coming of agriculture as one of bold social experiments, resembling a carnival parade of political forms. And they challenge any assumption that our ancestors lived in small egalitarian bands. And such an idea that anybody who thinks that means that they're consigning those ancestors to being childlike, simple, primitive. And yet, what Graeber and Wengrow never really consider is the complex reality of maintaining an egalitarian political balance. I mean, I could be kind of harsh and say, oh, I've just lost my picture. They've never been. Neither of them, of course, David Graeber, we lost him, the late David Graeber, but as an anthropologist, he didn't do any hunter-gatherer anthropology. David Wengrow is professor of comparative archaeology over in the Institute there, but his focus is on early urban societies. They never visited an egalitarian hunter-gatherer camp, which has, for somebody who comes from a society of hideous inequality, it has a transformative effect. It just changes the way, what you feel. We're looking at command central of a dry season camp in amongst the Hudson, Tanzania, with these older women of different generations of women. They're just kind of organizing everything. They're planning everything. They're planning the next digging sticks at the ready, next foraging expedition. This is, they're smoking their strong Maasai tobacco. They're dressed up to the nines because there's researchers in camp, and they are running a hunter-gatherer camp like this is a collective childcare operation, and this is command center for that. And the sense of what's going on in a camp like that. Well, this is, listen to Morna Finnegan's words, and I'm going to say why Morna Finnegan, who's coming to talk here later in the term. She says, complex egalitarianism cultivates individuality and autonomy through communal labor of distribution of social power. Now, why Morna Finnegan is so important is that she really prefigured the notion of oscillation of power between groups, and notably gender groups. So she says egalitarian societies do play routinely with a kind of shadow hierarchy where intersexual conflict and the threat of collapse serve as a powerful motor for the movement of power across the social landscape. So Mona's got this idea of keep it moving, never let it get stuck. So in hunter-gatherer camps like this, it is not just food that's demand shared. The key mechanism of egalitarianism, if somebody's got something, you need it, you demand it, they have to share it. The demand share just distributes all the resources around. But it isn't only food being demand shared, it is power itself. Polly Wiesner, long-term anthropologist with the Junquois, or the, as used to be known as the Hong, she defined the core of, an informant, she was talking to Junquois guy who defined the core of the culture. It's not trance dance, hunting techniques, apparel, or songs that are the essential elements of our culture, he said. Rather, relations of respect and appreciation for what others have to offer. We talk softly, unlike the Bantu, who are big penises, which is an interesting metaphoric expression for relations of dominance we'll reflect on later. Now, in human history, there have been no bolder social experiments than language and symbolic culture, and no more sophisticated or novel invention. In this article, in this discussion, I want to ask, what if these boldest of all social experiments by our ancestors, our African ancestors of Homo sapiens, in fact constrained the political possibilities? What if only certain kinds of political arrangements could have enabled language and symbolism to emerge? Then where does that leave Graeber and Wengrow on the infantilizing effects of imagining egalitarian ancestry? So I first want to say something, bring up a few quotes from some of the social anthropologists, particularly who spent a lot of time with egalitarian people. James Woodburn, obviously, and his usage of the term egalitarian, but also women anthropologists, because you're going to find out that I think that Graeber and Wengrow come up very short when it comes to matters of gender. And then I'm going to look at the main evolutionary models advanced for egalitarianism and how that's been linked. Far from being linked to childlike simplicity, the evolutionary models link egalitarianism to increasing cognitive sophistication. Then I'm going to talk about universal features of Homo sapiens that we simply wouldn't have evolved without prolonged periods of egalitarianism among human ancestors. And I'll consider the evidence that gender relations were quite central to that process. They were absolutely critical. And then what probable timelines? I want to give some timelines of when was this protracted tendency to egalitarianism. So one of the female social anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, Megan Wieseler, very famous as the collector of narratives and myths amongst the Junquois. She's written a beautiful new biography, Once Upon a Time Is Now, autobiography, very well worth getting hold of. And she says this about egalitarianism. Egalitarianism, though it may seem casual or lackadaisical to outsiders, or even a saccharine romantic concept, is underpinned by determined effort and by fierce and sustained attention to expectations and rules. I wondered whether, judging by its long-term success, this effective social technology had taken a lot of trial and error to perfect during prehistory. I came to think of egalitarianism as another of the great cultural achievements of humankind. Now, I'm absolutely with her on that one, especially on the idea that this would have taken a lot of pushing through in evolutionary terms of trial and error, that sometimes it would have gone somewhere, sometimes maybe it didn't work. And there's a long time period of that sort of building up. And also it's not just one of the great cultural achievements, it's like the achievement on which everything else really depends. So it is just the step, it's the matrix from which everything else can be generated. Now, for some reason, which we can discuss why it is, Graeber and wengrow really dislike the term egalitarianism, which is very regularly used by undergraduate anthropologists and interrogated by them. Graeber and wengrow repeat in their book a sort of mantra. It remains entirely unclear what egalitarian even means. They try out a sort of negative definition. Is it absence of hierarchy? And then they say, or is it living in some collective groupthink, adhering to an ideal people feel they ought to be the same? Well, Polly Wiesner absolutely gives that short shrift, since nomadic bands rely on people having diverse skills and respecting each other's diverse skills. Egalitarian relations, she says, are not about sameness in small-scale societies, but rather respect and appreciation of different skills offered by group members to build complementarity and dependency. And striking this balance between autonomy and interdependency is what gives egalitarianism its very complex, fluid dynamic. Now, of course, James Woodburn was the one who really who authored the classic article on egalitarian societies, the main person studying, social anthropologist studying with the Hadza, a friend who we lost just a year and a half ago now. And he was crystal clear why he chose this term. He really was the one choosing this term, egalitarian, in many ways. I've chosen to use the term egalitarian to describe these societies of near equals because the term directly suggests that the equality that's present is not neutral, not the mere absence of inequality hierarchy, but it is asserted. That's the key word. This attitude, politically assertive egalitarian, you've got to make it happen. It relies on deeds, not words. Or we could say, in terms of David Graeber's vocabulary, it needs direct action. You can never relax. You're always ready to make it, assert that ideology. So verbal rhetoric, he says, of equality may or may not be elaborated, but actions speak loudly. Equality is repeatedly acted out, publicly demonstrated in opposition to inequality. Now, Woodburn focused on, he conceded that there were many societies with, in some sense, egalitarian aspects. And because my argument is that we really evolved as an egalitarian species, that's no surprise. I remember David Graeber talking about how capitalism parasitizes on the fact that we are basically communist. It does, this is true. We've been forged, our nature's been forged in egalitarianism. And Woodburn particularly, James Woodburn particularly focused on what he called immediate return hunter-gatherers as the ones where this political attitude comes to full expression. Immediate return societies had no storage. They were very vigilant in egalitarian ideology and practice. They minimized specific personal dependency. Doesn't mean they minimize interdependency, but that one person relies on another person particularly. They want the network to spread very wide and evenly. They ensure freedom of choice for residents. People can live where they want, can go where they want. Everyone has access to necessities of life. Everyone is entitled to share. That's just normal. Now, there's problems about immediate return because the real immediate return societies, if you're looking from an evolutionary perspective, the chimpanzees hunting for colobus monkeys, that's total immediate return because they consume the monkey before it may even be dead, and they're all sort of pulling one way and another way. And chimpanzees are certainly a very immediate return, but they are certainly not egalitarian. But the main point here is what James Woodburn thought about relative prevalence of egalitarian immediate return and the more hierarchical delayed return type of hunting societies in the past. And he thought that before farming, there would be more hunting societies of both types. They were both likely to be ancient before agriculture kind of impacted. But he talks about immediate return society systems. They're not simple, though not simple in form. They're intrinsically simpler than delayed return systems. There would have been a time at which all societies had immediate return systems, fundamentally. It would have been some of the earliest human societies. And those societies, in James's experience from the Hadza, are remarkably stable and resistant to change through time. Early forms of hunter-gatherer organization would have shown that kind of egalitarianism and stability, therefore. Now, while Dawn of Everything authors reflexively identify egalitarian with assumptions of simple or primitive, actually, evolutionary anthropologists, behavioral ecologists have investigated the sophistication of cooperative, strategic, cognitive flexibility involved in egalitarian, supposed small-scale societies. I mean, basically, just as we talked about chimpanzees as the immediate return, you know, great ape societies can't do egalitarianism. They might have a few odd glimpses here and there of a bit of open window opening to a little bit of basic egalitarian relationship, but their societies are not structured by egalitarianism. They're structured heavily by hierarchy and dominance, and we're different. It seems egalitarianism is hard to explain if we go to look at Darwinian explanations, because, well, Darwinian theory premised on individual competition. You know, how do you explain everybody kind of coming out roughly equal in terms of fitness, in terms of wealth, resources, everything? One of the originators of what was called Machiavellian intelligence theory, Andrew Whiten, and his student, David Erdl, realized that Machiavellian intelligence could generate the difference between primate-style dominance hierarchies and typical hunter-gatherer egalitarianism. This is a beautiful dialectical model. Machiavellian intelligence is a very subtle idea. It's sometimes called social brain, but Machiavellian intelligence keeps the spikiness of the competition involved. It sees animals in complex social groups competing in evolutionary terms by becoming more adept at cooperation. So you compete by cooperating, gaining allies, negotiating allies, and you cooperate in order to compete. So it's a very dialectical, sort of slippery concept, subtle concept. And in this perspective of the social brain, the significant increases of brain size from monkeys to apes and then to hominins result from increasing political complexity and ability to use alliances for your kind of own ends. Erdl and Whiten gave a very dialectical explanation for human egalitarianism that they called counter-dominance. You increase the levels of Machiavellian intelligence, the ability to use alliances, and at a certain point, that ability to operate within alliances just exceeds the ability of any single individual, no matter how strong, no matter how dominant. If a dominant tries to dominate others, they will make an alliance against him, assuming it's him for now. And once that point's reached, to you, then the best strategy is no longer to try and dominate others. It is instead better to just resist being dominated. Just don't let anyone dominate you. And if that goes on with everybody, you end up with rough and ready egalitarian situation where nobody can tell anyone what to do, and everyone's resistant, asserting if anyone tries. So Erdl and Whiten were talking about this counter-dominance. They saw counter-dominance as absolutely fundamental to the evolution of human psychology, that's the evolutionary psychologists, with competing tendencies for individuals to get away with bigger shares if they could, if there was an opportunity, be a bit selfish, but faced with demands from others, just give in, settle, share equally, so on. And this model actually predicts a lot of what we get with egalitarian hunter-gatherers. They're very vigilant in case anyone's getting above themselves, trying to sequester resources. They use techniques of demand sharing to make sure those resources go around and around. They have this attitude, don't mess with me, using humor for leveling. And they just reject any possibility of coercion because no particular individuals acknowledge this being in charge. They might try, but it won't be accepted by everybody else. And so Whiten subsequently made this very interesting concept, deep social mind, which hasn't really caught on, but I think it captures the politics involved in what they termed, what Whiten and Erdl termed, the socio-cognitive niche of the emergence of hunter-gatherers. And that involved prolonged egalitarianism co-evolving with mutual mind reading. This mind reading here is mutual mind reading. Machiavellian intelligent primates, great apes, want to read the mind. They want to know what the other guy is thinking, but they don't want to let others know what they're thinking. What we're talking about here is mutuality of mind reading, which we're also going to talk about as intersubjectivity. And that, evolving those two together with cultural transmission, all of these three things are going to be just spiraling together and feeding back on each other to create the hunter-gatherer socio-cognitive niche, as he calls. Now, this chart is quite important, and I'm going to base a lot of discussion on it. Erdl and Whiten illustrated this trajectory of egalitarianism with the accompanying mutuality of mind reading and cultural transmission through what's called a U-shaped curve. And this is just a rough drawing of a hypothesized trajectory with hierarchy up there, egalitarianism coming right down at the base, going through evolutionary time. And we're coming from previous and ape-like or Australopithecine or whatever ancestors. We don't really know the time frame here. We're going to talk about that. And it's very hierarchical. And then something really changes and it starts really reducing the level of hierarchy and coming right down to a bottoming out, or let's say a maxing out of egalitarianism. Now, again, they don't specify, when is that? When does that happen? When is that? And then point C they've got on this, suddenly, whoosh, it goes right back up into hierarchy. Now, the thing is, they do specify this bit. They say, well, this is where hunter-gatherer societies give way to much more stratified, complex, supposedly complex, farming, agriculture, much more inequality going up. So this is prehistory leading into history. Now, of course, Graeber and Wengrow hate that. This is anathema for Graeber and Wengrow. They really, they're just not content with that story. I'm not going to argue about this bit because, Wengrow, comparative archaeologist of prehistory, he knows plenty about that. I'm arguing about this bit. And I'm saying this is real. This is real, this maxing out. And I'm going to try and put a time frame on that. And that for them to argue that, we could have just as much hierarchy as egalitarianism here. Sorry, it's not true. And of course, they Graeber and Wengrow just accuse anybody who thinks that that's happened of romanticism. If we say that our evolved psychologies, our emotions, our cognition was shaped by selection pressures when our ancestors wanted an egalitarian way of life. But Erdl and Whiten are pretty hard-bitten evolutionary psychologists of St Andrew's Scottish School. They're not obviously romantic. The point here is they are starting from a point of non-human hierarchy, despotic societies of primate politics. And their key question isn't how did we start becoming unequal? Their key question is how did we first get to be equal? That's the key question. And unless we know that bit, I don't think we can talk about that bit. Not easily. Now, this chart was actually originally produced by Bruce Nauft, or the idea for it. And then there was also Christopher Byrne in the 1990s, who were discussing these subjects of egalitarianism, violence, and resistance to dominance amongst hunter-gatherer ancestors. And Graeber and wengrow, they don't even know about Erdl and Whiten, I don't think. They make evolutionary anthropologist Christopher Boehm, with his notable book, his really great book, Hierarchy in the Forest, their chief target. They ignore Erdl and Whiten with the counter-dominance, which is quite an individualistic kind of idea. Instead, Boehm's model argues for, well, he calls it reverse dominance, a group or collective intention rather than an individualistic negotiation. Humans descend from great apes, just as Erdl and Whiten said, of course. Our distant ancestors would have been psychologically adapted to great ape politics of dominance, violence, and resistance. But in our lineage, in our ancestry, collective resistance culminated in everyone ganging up to prevent a would-be leader from dominating the group. Chimpanzee-style dominance was overturned by solidarity action coming from below. Chimpanzee, and this produced reverse dominance. And the interesting thing from a point of view of a social anthropologist is this is really discussing rule by a morally aware community, consciously determined to maintain equality. It's talking about things like morality and symbolism and ideology and that sort of thing. So reverse dominance generates morality, the wholesale coalition of everyone against any would-be alpha. And Graeber and wengrow are quite accepting of Boehm's idea. This is a little passage from their book. Boehm identifies a whole panoply of tactics collectively employed to bring would-be braggarts and bullies down to earth. Ridicule, shame, shunning, even sometimes assassination. We'll say more about that later. None of which have any parallel among other primates. They recognize that. And this is maybe one of the only places in the book where they mention other primates. It probably is, there may be two. Oh, it's gone. But they still, as soon as a very important point, they recognize Boehm is talking that the bullying behavior, the alpha bullying behavior may have something instinctual about it, but counter-bullying, that's not instinctual, that's cognitive, that is well thought out. I mean, that seems to me like, well, there's the egalitarianism, guys, you know, that is what it is. Remember James Woodburn, the politically assertive egalitarianism is just that. And when Boehm says, he says in his book, oh, well, before 12,000 years, humans were basically egalitarianism, they go, oh my God, you're casually tossing humans back into the Garden of Eden again. They just don't want to know it. Actually, Boehm correlates the process of increasing egalitarianism, reverse dominant behaviors, with our speciation as Homo sapiens in his book, Hierarchy in the Forest. Now, of course, there would have been variation of socio-political traits of behavior between individuals and between groups of people as well, in going back into the Middle Pleistocene and the ancestry of Homo sapiens. And Boehm argued from this background for selection for a very successful group strategy of politically conscious, egalitarian people who have got this idea of egalitarianism that would spread across groups, because it was very attractive to be non-dominant but non-submissive, and to get away, just walk away from any kind of despotism. Why not? And he argued group selection would have prevailed. Within group competition would have kept within groups, people had roughly similar fitness and resources. Between group competition would have favored the egalitarians. This is actually. Now, both of these key models in evolutionary thinking of Erdl and Whiten with counter-dominance and Boehm's reverse dominance, they capture aspects of hunter-gatherer politics. Erdl and Whiten provide evolutionary continuity of Machiavellian intelligence with individualistic or autonomous strategies. Boehm's reverse dominance engages with something revolutionary, a moral, collectively determined kind of ideas and symbolic ideas we can think of as well. But crucially, both of these models leave aside the question of gender. And I'm just going to start by looking at, what is the evidence in our anatomy, our bodies, our minds for ancestral egalitarianism? And then if I look at a couple, I'm going to take 2 or 3 aspects, starting with cooperative eyes. What is the evidence that these are highly gendered, that there would have been very significant aspects of gender strategy underlying the evolution of these characteristics? So our cooperative eyes are famously called cooperative eyes. We're comparing eyes of any human on the planet with the different eyes of all these different young great apes, quite young, some of them. And the shape of the eye with that long, elongated sort of oval shape, and the bright white or fairly white sclera with a dark iris. For any human being, you can just see what they're looking at, what they're interested in. You're judging, able to see their gaze direction. You're looking in people's eyes. You know what are they thinking about? What are they? You know exactly what they're thinking about. You know what's got their attention. And this is an absolutely key mechanism that from a very young age, all human children, nearly all human children, are locking into that mechanism, gaining, compared with other great apes, we humans possess a unique sensitivity to information from the eyes and to be understanding each other's emotional states as a result of that. By comparison, great apes and monkeys, primates in general, they're relatively round dark eyes. You know, there's a more or less here on apes and monkeys that can show some bits of sclera sometimes, and it's interesting that it changes by species. That more socially tolerant species may show more, less socially tolerant species less. But they're blocking off. They're not making it easy for anyone looking at them to read their gaze direction. They're not giving the information out in the same way. So, you know, this thing of can you see what I see? Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Is absolutely resting on this adaptation of mutual mind reading. Remember, deep social mind with Aiello, it's mutual mind reading is a critical feature going along with egalitarianism. And it's impossible to imagine cooperative eyes evolving if you're in a system where you might be bullied. You're not going to want to let bullies know what you're thinking of what you're going to do next. So this is really talking about a situation where there must be some limited aspect of egalitarianism for this to evolve. The most convincing account of how, when, and why intersubjectivity in cooperative eyes began to evolve is given by Sarah Hrdy in her landmark book, Mothers and Others. I should say, graeber and wengrow mention Hrdy one time in their book, and they don't really know who she is. They do not understand that she is probably the leading evolutionary anthropologist and sociobiologist on the planet. They call her a feminist, which is not a good description, really. She could be called a Darwinian feminist, but they just don't have a clue who she is. And that's about us. They mentioned Christopher Byrne, they mentioned Sarah Hrdy. This is about all the people, the evolutionary anthropologists they're even talking about. So what her argument is really simple. We do babysitting in all human societies. Mothers are happy to hand over their offspring, however young, even hours after birth, they're handing over their offspring to others to look after temporarily, give mum a break for whatever reason. African hunter-gatherers just deploy this collective form of childcare. It's absolutely routine. It's part of their whole way of life. It would have been routine in the heritage of our ancestry, almost for sure. Now, it's an absolute stark contrast that hyper-possessive great ape mothers, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, they just don't let their babies go. They can't let them go for the first few months. they're strong and the babies are strong enough to resist, be able to stand up to to difficult bad handling, and they can't trust anyone else out there enough, is what it is. And one of the key points there is that a mother in a wild chimp group or a bonobo group, she doesn't have a close female relative, which is saying, well, we're just setting up this little triad of mum, baby, carer, the arch, like the prime carer is going to be mum's mum, is the obvious person. The grandmother model goes along here. The idea of female kin bonds is straight in there. And what happens is you set up the pressures for checking each other out with eye gaze, for checking, the little girl has checked, where's mom? But here's grandma, okay, and how's grandma feeling? And you're getting this triadic linkage between everybody, where you want to show what you're feeling and you want to know what the other guys are feeling. So it just gives a process for this emergence of intersubjectivity. And it's all predicated on this eye gaze and cooperative eyes, basically, as well. And that's just, there's a lovely Hadza grandmother showing off her daughter's children, just to say that with African hunter-gatherers, a residence pattern where a mum is with her daughter in the early years that a daughter's having children, that may be 2 or 3 children before a daughter's likely to move to another camp if she does. So we are different from great apes. Great apes can't do this because very rarely is a mum where her daughter is. So there's just not, even though we've shown now that it's been found now that there are chimps with some post-reproductive lifespan, some menopause in the Ngogo chimp groups. They don't live with their daughters, so they can't do grandmother behaviors. So this gives us a really gendered initial condition for Whiten's deep social mind idea. Core female kin coalitions involved in this cooperative childcare create bubbles or pockets of increasing social tolerance, egalitarian sharing, intersubjective understanding. These are exactly the conditions that promote cultural intelligence and transmission, curiosity and exploration. All of those features will just snowball with this sort of social structure and setup. Okay, so we can just think in terms of deep social mind, where are those cooperative eyes actually evolving? Presumably all of this descent into this early part of the U-shaped curve has got to be connected with the emergence of the cooperative eyes and the emergence of babysitting, enabling intersubjectivity. And if we then go to the next feature I'm going to talk about is our incredibly large brains, which couldn't ever have got there unless we had had this long period of egalitarianism. So what's this? This is giving us a constraint on the time when the beginning of that U-shaped curve has to start. So what we're looking at, sorry, that's Australopithecines. These are specimens, actual fossil specimens from 3 million to 2 million years, going down through time. And these are measurements of brain size, brain volume. And why the brain volume matters so much is that the mother of the offspring who's going to become an adult-sized brain volume of whatever it is, that mother has to provide all the energy for the early years, most of the growth of that brain through breastfeeding. She's got to find all the nutrients that she needs to pass to her offspring, and then she's got to adequately support that offspring. Now, there's a concept known as the gray ceiling, and we've got, that's 1 times chimpanzee volume. And basically all these Australopithecine specimens are knocking up against the gray ceiling. And what the gray ceiling is if a mum is a single mum, which all great ape mums, they're single mums, there's nobody to help them. That is the max brain capacity they can manage. They can't go further because they just bust themselves. They wouldn't be able to support the child, the offspring's growth. They wouldn't be able to support themselves. So this is a constraint. It's a ceiling. And wham, our ancestry went through Homo, this is early Homo, beginning Homo erectus, large brain Homo erectus, twice chimpanzee volume. Okay, the only possibility here is that this cooperative childcare, the allocare, that mum is getting help there. And this triad of the carer with the mum and the baby and handing over the baby is starting to happen, with grandmother as the arch person likely to be the helper in the first place. And of course, that has implications for development of life history, post-reproductive lifespan, and so forth. Homo erectus then stays fairly steady. But if we just pop back onto our slide there, we're just saying, yeah, this has got to be starting to happen with Homo erectus. It's got to be starting to happen there. And so we'll come back here. And then something extraordinary happens again in the last, well, this is the last, it starts about 500,000, a bit more than 500,000 years ago, this going up and up with the brain size. For both ourselves and Neanderthals, I'm not really talking much about Neanderthals today, but so what that I'm saying that this very large, very expensive brain, we're seeing now the last 1,000,000 years. This is Middle Pleistocene, and this is the blue circles are our actual ancestors. Well, it's the actual Homo sapiens. So our ancestry is back here. Homo sapiens, first stage of our speciation, second stage of our speciation. First stage is a flat face, second stage, a very globular cranium skull. And it's still that brain size still going up. It's not decreasing, but increasing. Because mothers required very reliable transfers of energy from others to mothers with offspring. These increasing brain sizes cannot have been favored in social conditions of any kind of reduced, they needed to have reduced dominance, much greater egalitarianism. If there had been competition for nutrient-dense foods that these mothers needed, and lack of sharing to those burdened mothers, it would result in the brain sizes going in a different direction. We could think about fossils like Homo naledi as a kind of parallel example to Homo, large-brained Homo species, that they've gone in another direction. Other small-brained Homo that Chris Stringer was talking about, Homo luzonensis, Homo floresiensis as well. So the level, we can actually say that looking at brain sizes, you're tracking the level of egalitarianism in these Homo lineages, just simply by measuring brain sizes using the fossil record. Your brains can only expand as materially more energy gets channeled to females and offspring. And that again implies gendering of the strategies that enable that to happen. Male dominance, harassment, strategic control of females, which plenty of paleoanthropologists, they say, well, that would have been happening. This would have obstructed these unprecedented increases of brain size. Your populations with male dominance, sexual conflict, risk of infanticide, incredibly expensive for mothers of this very large-brained offspring, face that risk. Our forebears, they solved the problem of great ape male dominance, harnessing males into routine support for these extraordinary large-brained offspring. And just to very quickly flash up, I need to keep going a bit faster, but to quickly flash up, more evidence in our bodies of how we maintained egalitarianism is literally our reproductive physiology, the sexual signals that we have evolved with, that Homo sapiens have. Our reproductive physiology is leveling in the sense of it spreads fitness around males much more equally. It's time wasting, that's the way it works. Concealed, unpredictable ovulation with continuous sexual receptivity is all meant to scramble information to men about exactly when is a moment of fertility. So what that does is it completely undermines a great ape male dominant strategy of home in on a fertile female, deal with her, wham bam, dealt with her, find the next one. That's the grade 8 male strategy. So that's not going to work anymore. And this quote, this slogan comes from Bayaka Benjele, hunter-gatherer, Jerome Lewis recorded for us. Their rallying cry is one woman, one penis, yeah, one at least each. If males are useful, everybody ought to have one, at least one. Don't have to have only one, but yeah. So that is a principle of equality, absolutely a principle of equality, as against, it's resisting harems, it's resisting any male grabbing more than his fair share. So this is my version of the U-shaped curve coming out of all that. And it's kind of got the same thing. I'm not going to try and draw that bit. David Wengrow can do that, I don't mind. But here, we really are talking about that plunging down of egalitarianism with erectus, the intersubjectivity, the cooperative eyes.
It's not plunging down, it's going up.
Oh, sorry, no, egalitarianism maxing. This is maxing out. I mean, it's just a dramatic fall of dominance into egalitarianism. And it's a kind of feedback process. Okay, it maybe stops a little bit with erectus. There might still be a bit of male dominance in the, you know, in the system there happening, a bit of push and shove, and yeah. But then for this last part of the brain expansion, this is where our egalitarianism is maxing out with the onset of kind of our immediate ancestry of Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens. What happens after that, we can all argue and debate, but this is real, and it's kind of proved by brain size and what would have happened, what would have necessarily happened. Okay, the last bit of the features of humans that are just, you know, you've got to come out of egalitarianism or we wouldn't have these features, is very simple. Just symbolism and language itself really depend on egalitarianism, certainly in their evolution. These are some quotes from a couple of social anthropologists who noticed that, you know, culture's the oldest equalizer. This is Marshall Solins, an old colleague of and supervisor for David Graeber, I believe. Among animals capable of symbolic communication, the weak can collectively connive to overthrow the strong. Now, in terms of Erdl and White and Machiavellian intelligence, he's got that the wrong way round. It's because Machiavellian intelligence, the weak can ally to overthrow the strong, that we became animals capable of symbolic communication. It's that way round. Victor Turner, a famous social anthropologist, noted the powers of the weak. This is kind of Victor Turner's way of talking about reverse dominance with Christopher Byrne. The powers of the weak, those who were vulnerable, those who were kind of the lowest of the low, in ritual and in symbolic performance, become very significant, as it's central to Victor Turner's thinking. But let's go to David Graeber himself, because I love judo throwing David Graeber with his own thoughts. This is from fragments of an anarchist anthropologist. If you have the power to hit people over the head whenever you want, you don't have to trouble yourself too much figuring out what they think's going on, and therefore, generally speaking, you don't. Hence, the surefire way to simplify social arrangements, I love this bit, to ignore the incredibly complex play of perspectives, passions, insights, desires, and mutual understandings that human life is really made of. Beautiful description of intersubjectivity and everything that's going on with our cooperative eyes. Exactly that. Is to make a rule and threaten to attack anyone who breaks it. Well, no, sorry, you've just like Solins, David, you've messed that up there, because if you don't have that, you can't make rules, because you can't share ideas on an equal basis of equality. So this is just this is just an oppressive bully. Of course, it's possible within modern bureaucracy for this to happen, but this can't evolve without this in the first place. You need the egalitarianism first. And in his book, Debt, Graeber's describing baseline communism, which he also does in Dawn of Everything, in terms of adhering to a default principle from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. And that can be understood by biologists as kind of cooperation between strangers. And there's absolutely no question for language to work. I'm talking to you, you're listening to me, and there are people here I've never met before. Language works on a basis of this assumption of communism, on a basis of cooperation between strangers, and it's just fundamental requirement for language. And Graeber talks about this basic attitude of human sociability to language use. He says, this is in Debt, conversation is a domain particularly disposed to communism. Absolutely. Language is the mutual exploration of each other's minds, requires non-violent, safe space and time to be able to work. Even insults and put-downs, he says, derive most of their power from the shared assumption people do not ordinarily act this way. Even that is telling us about the nature of language. So conversations are necessarily a consensual process, and it expresses quintessential opposite of relations of dominance. It relies on the ultimate in intersubjective ability to look through the eyes of the other. Fundamentally, an egalitarian matrix is the only possible ground for evolution of language. And in their book, one of the best, loveliest chapters of the book is very early in the book. You read it, the one about Kandiaronk, the famous Huron-Wendat chief, who was famed for superior socio-cognitive linguistic skills. During the late 17th century, 1690s, he became very famous for arguing Jesuits and French governor generals under the table. Graeber Wengrow explained, why is this? If you live in a society where nobody can tell anyone else what to do, that's politically assertive egalitarianism, you have to argue and persuade if you want to get a consensus about anything. And that's why the remarkable, well-practiced oratorical skills of Native Americans, when the Europeans first came across them, Europeans who were subject to the arbitrary power of the relics of feudalism, by contrast, had to follow orders, and that's not going to develop reasoned consensus argument very well. And that principle applies as much or more to the evolutionary emergence of language itself in our ancestral past. It would require a prolonged phase of relative egalitarianism to get established. And that constraint just refutes the idea that egalitarian origins is a myth and that it implies primitive simplicity. We just wouldn't be here as speaking, talking, singing, dancing human beings without it. And what I want to finish, well, I can do a little bit more for gender. I want another 5 to 10. I'm going to take you through Mwajo. Some of you may have been here for Jerome and Chris at the end of last term when Jerome was explaining Mwajo. And well, I'm going to take you through, what are the gender aspects of this egalitarianism model? Because in Dawn of Everything, really don't do very much gender at all. Graeber and Wengrow don't have much to say on gender. It's just an add-on. It's just a bit of lip service. They don't deal with it thoroughly. I think it's fair to say that. If anyone wants to argue back, you can. There are strong grounds that gendered strategies are just central to the evolution of all these features of the eyes, the intersubjectivity, the huge brain size. Well, babysitting and allocare, they wouldn't only have involved females. Males would have been involved too, but female strategic needs would have been absolutely critical as drivers of mutuality of mind. Similarly, the demands of increasing brain size and energy costs for mothers would lead to very novel and specific female strategies for responses, which would have been coalitionary and cooperative alliance responses, and also individual female choice. People have talked about models of self-domestication applying to the Homo sapiens species. Female ancestors would have been overwhelmingly influential in a process of self-domestication through choice of males with reduced reactive aggression. Okay? That is what really is what domestication is reducing reactive aggression. Egalitarian and cooperative childcare coalitions provided the context for sharing intentions and emotional states, and such unprecedented levels of trust in those childcare coalitions would have been the basis to begin communicating and playing with conventional shorthand vocalizations. That's the basis for speech. And I will talk about how Moajo has a special role in that. I should say, I just want to mention Bruce Nauft, who drew that original U-shaped curve. He always kept sticking his hand up and always kept saying, but what role do females play in dominance or counter-dominance? You know, neither Christopher Bone with reverse dominance nor Irwin White really could say anything except an add-on. They didn't see females as the center of the process. But Nauft did. He really questioned the intrinsic male bias in models of egalitarianism. Now, unfortunately, this can be tracked back to James Woodburn's Egalitarian Societies, where James he owned up. He said, well, I'm really talking about males here. And he had lethal weaponry as very important, because any male with lethal weaponry can knock off a dominant, obnoxious male when who's gone to sleep. You just need to scratch with it. You don't even need to be a man, really. You just need to scratch someone with arrow poison and they're done for. So the idea that lethal weaponry is a very US gun lobby idea, that everybody having lethal weaponry ensures egalitarianism. But it's an incredible male perspective. Female energetic requirements meant they needed to ensure that newly developed accurate throwing weaponry was put to use effectively by humans against game animals, not by men against each other. Bone drew on work of Richard Lee with the Kalahari Junkwasi to identify reverse dominance tactics that went from playful mockery and joking all the way to execution squads. And unfortunately, there is a tendency, you know, Christopher Bone himself, but even more Richard Wrangham in his book Goodness Paradox. It's a book that's very good in places and terrible in other places. But Wrangham has an exclusively male version of self-domestication, which focuses on execution squads. It's basically gangs of men putting to death any man who's so obnoxious and violent that they can't deal with his reactive aggression. Yeah. So planned aggression against other men, that's okay, as long as you're killing off somebody with reactive aggression. And this would be males kind of selecting themselves. I'm sorry, Richard Wrangham, but you know, you think females have nothing to do with this? These events where there might be executions, which Richard Lee recorded a very few where there was such planning. I mean, they happen like once in 10 years. Of course, the threat of them is there. But workaday tactics, the things that go on every day, laughter, mimicry, leveling, it reveals the gendered dimension of reverse dominance. Women, and they're usually older women, you can think of Victor Turner's powers of the weak, they're widows, individually and collectively are central to bringing men down with a bump. And we had Jerome telling us last term about this technique, Moajo, that involves a kind of pantomime stand-up comedy. An older woman begins to mime and caricature someone's stupid behavior, drawing a crowd, and this quickly becomes really hilarious as the onlookers join in, they copy her moves, they encourage with noises and comments, but no one says the name of the individual that's being targeted. Until it dawns on the target, oh no, that's me, they mean. And he's seeing, assuming it's a he, it's not a, he begins to laugh, what an idiot he's been, or more likely, he kind of storms off because he just can't face it. Right? But either way, everything gets forgiven and forgotten. He comes creeping back to camp and nobody says anything. No executions necessary. So Jerome says this, eventually men only tolerate such explicit criticism from women. If men do this, it easily leads to serious fights. Widows have a special place in this type of humorous but directed criticism and are expected to do this in front of the whole camp at moments of high tension or when someone's committed a grave error. A good performer will succeed in calming the atmosphere by allowing everyone to laugh at themselves. Indeed, if the person being criticized is present, the mwajo will only end when they laugh publicly too. However, on realizing they've become the center of the camp's mirth, the wrongdoer flees and hides in the forest till things calm down. Now, I put up a slide from Dasha Balmerkova's PhD from a few years ago, and unfortunately, she hasn't written this as an article, not to my knowledge, so I've got to refer to her PhD, but she's written the finest ethnography of reverse dominance with, she's a student of Jerome's. She documented and participated in mwajo herself, and she describes 3 specific contexts. Just want to go through these because they're powerful. Normative, she calls it, which are reenactments, these widows doing these reenactments of people's stupid behavior with one or more women to get the target to see their own silly behavior. The second one she calls coalitionary, which is amongst a bunch of women. There isn't necessarily any target present. The women are just having, it's fun and entertainment, just amusing themselves. But it's very solidarizing, and it gets the women, you know, sharing an idea, an opinion. They get it, kind of the same idea. And then she's got gender competitive. She put it gender competition, but I've just changed the English there a bit. Gender competitive, mwajo. Now, this is a full ritualized response, which mocks men in general, especially male sexuality and ineptitude, or challenges any male insult that comes to women as a group. So Dasha sees this as a female militant reverse dominant strategy. And examples range from the standard practice of female ngoku forest spirit ceremony to dynamic reassertion, think of Woodburn's political assertion of female values as and when needed. Now, some such leveling technique as mwajo could have a very deep root in our ancestry. It wouldn't have been called mwajo by Homo erectus, but it's linked to the evolution of capacities of intersubjectivity, seeing ourselves as others see us. Mwajo doesn't need language. It operates as pantomime and action sequences. It offers a stepping stone, therefore, both on the way to ritual and on the way to language. Now, in the case of normative, one case of normative mwajo that Dasha was talking about, the performance making the target, as it was a woman in this case, see her silly actions right in front of her eyes by the activity. The process of exaggerated repetition of pantomime sequences gives us potential mechanism to scaffold language emergence. So parts of the action sequence could be, so somebody doing some particular movement, part of the action sequence could be shorthanded into increasing language-like tags with accompanying noises. In this chart Dasha has of all these different ways that women express their solidarity, she has this sound synchronism with these little sort of sung out sounds that they make, that sort of making together, attached to these pantomimes. In these situations, to the extent that the target, the individual target, laughs at themselves, the participants move towards sharing a shorthand reference or token for a concept, a word that's sung out in that action. And at the same time, they move together in sharing moral emotions. And the shared laughter just maintains the egalitarian ethos that's vital to the whole process. It's like everything comes together there. Now, in these two, coalitionary, gender competitive, we're going towards ritual. Mwajo tends towards ritual as the first is, the coalitionary is kind of a coordinating rehearsal for occasions when a full-scale militant, sex militant response is required. The first the coalitionary might seem to be just for fun, but it primes the women's solidarity with the particular coalitions. But at a hint of threat of challenge from men, the entire women's community coalesces in reverse dominance ritual. Women's Ngoku spirit ensures periodic neutralizing of male dominance in any form through hilarious reenactment of men's sexual antics. And I'm thinking back to the Kalahari guy who was talking about the Bantu as big penises. Well, here the Bayaka women are enacting, like with big penises, the behavior of the Bayaka men. It's that metaphor of sort of sexual dominance being turned back and reflected against the in reverse dominance. And that's women's weaponry. It's not lethal. The test of a man being able to see himself through the eyes of others and being able to laugh at himself would be a major aspect of female selection for reduced reactive aggression, actually, in that process. And Chris and Jerome have talked about the co-evolution of ritual and speech, but Mwajo is absolutely central to both parts of that process, almost for sure. So on these arguments, I'll wrap up very quickly, but I want to come back to Morna Finnegan, who's important, and because she's going to be coming later in the term to talk. Well, I was going to say something about Oka, but I said about that last term. Let's just run through it very quickly. No, I'm just going to go through the arguments and get to Morna. I hope it's another 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
You haven't got time to give yoga now.
Only quick, real quick. Well, I can leave out the Oka. I mean, it is just the template for the reverse dominance ritual. I can go to the end. But one of the part, you started by saying that they ignored Africa. I mean, graeber and wengrow, you know, from what I've said so far, really, egalitarianism can't emerge without fundamental gender egalitarianism asserted in ritual performance. And far from simplicity, this egalitarian political process gave rise to a cutting edge of creative cultural intelligence, resulting in playful, imaginative, shared human worlds. Attempts at control and dominance would lead to an evolutionary, a different direction. This wouldn't lead to where we are. Simply put, populations of the Middle Pleistocene with more hierarchical tendencies were the least likely to have become language-speaking, large-brained, singing, healing, dancing ancestors of Homo sapiens. Yeah, well, I can leave.
The diagram.
Well, I was going to just slag off. Do people want me to carry on with this? Just slag off graeber and wengrow for treating Africa's role in human cultural origins in just a few, literally 3 or 4 sketchy pages, is what they do. Their book is called Dawn of Everything, and Africa has 4 pages. That is it. And they claim, the only thing we can reasonably infer about social organization among our earliest ancestors is that it's likely to have been extraordinarily diverse. That's the only thing we can say. No, sorry, contrary to this guesswork, I argue the populations who eventually became the ancestors of everyone alive today were highly constrained to be egalitarian. Without this, just no language, no ritual, symbolic domain, no large brains, no human-like kinship or morality. Even though it is true that African early Homo sapiens populations had big morphological diversity, the Moroccan Jebel Hoods, the South African Florisbad, Herto in Ethiopia, very morphologically diverse, they are remarkably similar, it appears, in terms of shared cultural traditions, the length and breadth of the African continent. And we have really been shown this by this paper of Rimtadas Dapshauskas and his colleagues, The Emergence of Habitual Oka Use in Africa and its Significance for the Development of Ritual. So I've just been talking about the ethnography of hunter-gatherer women's use of ritual in reverse dominance. Well, this is really the archaeological evidence of the spread of ritual traditions, which we argue are reverse dominant ritual traditions. And therefore, I'm going to give you a date. And this gives us the date of where are we maxing out egalitarianism. So what Dapshauskas, they're answering the question when and where habitual ochre use emerged and how it produced ritual. They use very sophisticated mathematical methods of time averaging, identifying 3 continent-wide phases, a very initial phase from 500,000 years ago, just spots down in South Africa, some in East Africa. From 330,000 years ago, you're starting to get quite a bit coming up across South Africa. We're getting it all the way up Rift Valley.
The origin of art.
Well, we're dealing with, I'm just doing what they're saying. The Dept are identifying the artifacts of 100 Middle Stone Age sites. These are Forest Smith sites as well. And the counting the frequency of the intensity of ochre use. And it has to be said, just to cut to the chase, this is red ochre. It's not it is nearly all of it red ochre. But this is where the explosion occurs. 160,000, and you can see all over South Africa, East Africa, North Africa. By 160,000, this is, they're saying, a third of the sites is, and this is their picture of, this is what we see the human symbolic revolution with this initial emergent phase, take off. This is our egalitarianism marks, take off here. Okay, what?
That's very briefly.
If you let me talk. 3 decades ago, the authors, a long time ago now, the authors of the Female Cosmetic Coalitions hypothesis, which was me, Chris, and Ian Watts, I don't know if Ian's here, took the position, just like in Dept, that regular occurrence of ochre marked ritual activity critical to the emergence of symbolic cognition. And they argued reproductive stress on mothers of increasingly large-brained offspring drove signaling strategies in female coalitions. Women simply needed more energy to meet the extra metabolic costs of those large brains, and they turned on the leisured sex, males, to provide more reliably. Their demands for increased investment from men exploited the key signal of menstruation. Why is menstruation so critical? Because when most women of the group would be pregnant or breastfeeding or menopausal, a woman who's cycling, menstruating, that implies very soon fertility. And in a Darwinian world, that immediately grabs attention. It's going to grab attention. And so to deal with this problem, women created cosmetic rituals to bleed together, resisting the advance of any male who tried to see, anyone who wants to be a dominant and try and single out who is the actual menstruating. No, it's not going to work. It's not going to work, mate. Don't even think about it. This is our reverse dominance against the dominant. There's reverse dominance, total coalition, because actually the males who want to help the females will be on their side against any would-be dominant. Wholesale coalition against a dominant male, creating moral consciousness, bleeding, everything. Taboos on bleeding, shared imaginary concepts of blood and fertility. So it's creating, it's proto-symbolic and it's proto-moral. Now, at the time when we wrote this paper, we proposed reproductive stress, motoring. We called it sham menstruation then, and it's had a rebrand, Female Cosmetic Coalitions, but sham menstruation may have been most acute in the period 160,000 to 140,000, the height of the penultimate glacial cycle, which is like 30 years ago. We preempted what Dept and colleagues have actually demonstrated. And in that demonstration of the ochre record, there were also the shell beads with ochre residue on them, which are now dating in North Africa as old as 140. So 160 to 140, that is when we are maxing out egalitarianism. Really, that's our date. That is our date. Given an archaeological time frame for the emergence of ritual culture during the second phase of our speciation as a dynamic form of reverse gender dominance, then how does that perspective reflect on the key question which is posed by Graeber and Wengrow in their book? This is a very interesting question. How did we get stuck? Meaning stuck in a world of hierarchy, inequality, unable to switch back to our former conditions of egalitarianism. They claim that's the real question, how we got stuck, rather than trying to seek the origin of social inequality. But their excellent question is hard to address without first grasping, how did we get to be equal? What happened here that we got this incredible? Because they leave aside Africa, they focus on the European Upper Paleolithic, 30,000 years ago, looking at, very interesting evidence of very elaborate burials, and they advance an intriguing interpretation that in highly seasonal environments in Ice Age Europe, these would have been relics of a very seasonally flexible social structure, which switched between periods of real hierarchy and periods of egalitarianism when he overthrew the hierarchy. Now, that oscillation model, as I said right at the beginning, it resembles the politics of bodies in motion proposed by Mona Finnegan in her Ph.D. and her subsequent articles. And Mona talks about a pendulum of power, a push-pull motion between ritual groups of women and men among Central African forest people. Only by keeping bodies moving in dialogue can fixity of hierarchy be resisted. Women won't let power get stuck. Their coalitions are always fizzing and churning, ready to leap into action if it's required. They keep setting a rhythm or dialogue or dances going. But rather than a seasonal oscillation, this is periodic on women's terms. It connects to lunar and menstrual cycles and idioms. Finnegan asks, what are the implications for a society when the story that's ritualized through bodily comportment highlights female reproductive anatomy, female bodily fluids, female desire, and reflects these back to the community as cultural power? It just seemed to me Graeber and Wengrow failed to see that this oscillatory periodic motion is the way that egalitarianism works. Communism in motion, as Finnegan called it, the nimble lunar periodicity, which is typical of African hunter-gatherer ritual action, prevents the hierarchy from taking root, whereas slower seasonal periodic switches, by contrast, allow power to get entrenched. Okay, I think that's enough. Have I buried them yet? Let's come out of the share. Sorry about that. Sorry, it went on too long. Chris went on too long at the beginning as well. Great. Well, we have got quite a bit of chat, and we've got plenty of participants here. It's lovely to see that. And I'm going to sit down to check the Zoom. Any questions? Yeah, anything in the chat that's really should come out, and anybody with questions? Wrangham book, sometimes odd, yes. Totem, somebody's saying Wrangham's book is like Freud, Totem and Taboo. I couldn't agree more. Very good analogy there.
There's been a revolution in Freud's book.
In Freud's, there's a revolution, yeah. Well, there's sort of a... Once Upon a Time is Now is free to download as an ebook. Thanks, Catherine. That is a beautiful book to download. Oh, that's wonderful to know that. For Megan Biesler. It's a story of her work amongst the jeune classe, and it's a beautiful book.
Anyone in this room want to ask a question?
Yeah, anybody in the room, and then Manchego, if anybody in the room. Sorry. The author is Once Upon a Time is Now, Megan Biesler, and there's a Berghahn Books link that you could search for downloading. Megan Biesler is spelt. Have you got that? That's not a board. Is that a board marker? We can write Biesler up there. You could buy it. Once Upon a Time is Now. It is whiteboard, right? It's not a forever permanent. Great. Any question? Otherwise, we'll let Manchego go.
Megan, what's your favorite thing about the book? Obviously, I'm going to get wrong with it. Going to get anything right.
The favorite thing about it is its whole existence, really. That the Candy Rock chapter was a lot of fun because it felt like it's proving a lot of the thesis. But I mean, the thing of the book, it's not meant to go to specialists, and a lot of specialists, when they see their own area mangled a bit, get angry with it. And when we see immediate return hunter-gatherers being mangled a bit, obviously we get het up, and yeah. But the question, why did we get stuck, is a very good question. If they opened it up for gender and
Does
thought
anyone
much
know
harder.
why we got stuck, according to them, what their actual answer is?
Can anyone who's read it explain it?
Anyone remember what it is?
Have we had many people read this?
They
book?
took-
You got to read it right to the end.
Well, they talk about European monarchs who made this terrible mistake of confusing love and care for their subjects with control.
Oh, the public reference, James I.
Yes, that's right.
So
They're
Yeah,
kind of
the
saying-
Zoom people aren't hearing all this,
Well,
but
okay,
yeah,
I mean,
you
when
could
it comes
tell.
to how and why did we get stuck, instead of thinking in terms of the transition from the kind of thing Camilla's been talking about, a system of matrilocal residence and bride service and women's coalitions and men having to visit their partners in order to get sex, but also having to bring, meat as hunters. And then something terrible happening, namely, at a certain point, everything switches from men visiting their partners to actually men getting their partners to come to them and live locally, so that a young woman is stuck with her in-laws. And then, of course, the man who's in control of his wife then himself, yes, confuses his love for that woman with his coercive control over her. It's transferred all that to James I. And you
Yeah.
think, what? What?
Mm.
You mean to say that everything went wrong with around James I or some desperate? I mean, come on, it's a bit earlier than that when things got stuck in patriarchy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lots of good comments on the Zoom here. Manchego, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I had sort of a two-part, I guess it's either a two-part question or two closely related. The first part is, when did, I've been seeing reconstructions of Australopithecines and even earlier that have the visible sclera already. Do we know?
Well, they're artists' impressions.
Yeah, do we know if that's even close to accurate, or is that just a guess?
Oh, yeah, these are $64,000 questions, which are but I'm taking the general trend of encephalization. The general trend of encephalization is looking like gray ceiling, can't get through there, which doesn't mean that there isn't some beginning of variation, or some populations might have a bit more success than others. Even with early Homo, they're kind of really they're really Australopithecines.
Yeah.
And with great apes, there are some that will show, like maybe 5 or 10% of a chimp population might show quite a bit of white. But so there's variability, because that's what natural selection acts on, yeah. But at the moment, you've got to go with the general trend. I'm just being basic with the U-shaped curve there, and giving some constraints. When does the process start? When is it maxing? Oh, we got Ben Gleason. It's a pity he didn't come earlier. Did Manchego want to say another thing? And then we move to
Part two is with I don't know how soon did primates start losing the olfactory ability, because for the cosmetic coalition to actually be effective, men, and as human beings, really can't be able to smell very well. And does that go back?
Humans are not good at smell comparatively.
Yeah, but what about the great apes?
The primates who've been selected for color vision and a lot of visual acuity, daylight living primates, have probably, relative to prosimians, lost considerably in terms of olfactory. It's an interesting question, but I don't think it I don't think it really impacts that much on female. I mean, by that stage, humans have not got a great sense of smell, relatively. Homo
Right.
do not have comparatively. It's an interesting line of discussion. Yeah. I'll try and I'm holding this thing up here, and I just want to put it in a place where it's going to show. That might work. So Ivan, do you want to go? And also questions in the room if you've got some. Ivan?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really great talk, Camilla. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, first thing, just a quick comment on what Manchego just mentioned. I mean, I do my research with Batak hunter-gatherers in Malaysia, and when they found out my wife was pregnant, they no longer wanted me to go into the forest because they said that dangerous animals would be able to smell the fact that she was pregnant, so I couldn't go in. It's the same if my wife had been menstruating or something. So, which is very similar to what you find in Amazonia and many other places too. Just a quick comment there. Anyway, like I said in the chat, I mean, I think a major problem of the book is it's, you know, got this grandiose title, The Dawn of Everything. And in fact, it's not the dawn of everything at all. It's really, I mean, what they do say about cities is really interesting. What they say about, you know, the ethnography of the Americas, I learned enormous when I read all that. It's very
I was learning plenty as well. Yeah,
and also I think that they kind of employ what kind of quite cheap rhetorical strategies in the way that they'll, you know, actually they're talking about 30,000 years, but then say humans have been around this long, so kind of making out as if they're talking about a much longer period, which they're not. Okay. But anyway, I kind of question, Camilla. I mean, they talk about the site in Turkey quite a bit, don't they?
Göbekli Tepe, yes.
Göbekli Tepe. I mean, it is an interesting site. It's around 30,000 years old, I think, built by hunter-gatherers. But I don't know that much about the site because I haven't read the original archaeological papers from it. But I would assume this is a place which is resource rich in a similar way to kind of the northwest coast, such as like Haida-Quacatil, such as America, where you perhaps got a large amount of perhaps migratory animals coming through or something. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I'm not a very good specialist for Göbekli Tepe, I have to say.
Okay. Well, anyway,
I can't give you chapter and verse on that.
Maybe someone will know, but I would imagine that site and some of the ones they talk about in a few others, Ukraine, I think they mention. I would imagine if you've got
those are subsequent to hunter-gatherer. The Ukraine sites, unless you're talking about Sungir,
right?
I don't know which ones you mean, because they're the cities, the Moldova cities. Those are the latest subsequent, which they're trying to make out as much as potentially matriarchal or very gender equal. So they only talk about gender equality when they're talking about urban environments. They don't talk about gender equality with hunter-gatherers.
I realise that. But what I mean is I'm trying to get to the question. So when you get closer to the contemporary period, so 30,000 years, 20,000 years, 15,000 years, etc., how much has the human population expanded? Because I mean, when people are small, if someone, like a strategy amongst hunter-gatherers, someone starts bossing around, you move away. But what happens when people are restricted in a certain area? Was something like that perhaps happening? And then,
well, it's possible, yes. I mean, they don't have places to go.
Anyway, that's my question. Could that also kind of competition over resources as human populations grew allow for kind of delayed return hunter-gatherers? Because you wouldn't want to be bossed around. You'd think you'd just avoid it by moving away. What is it?
There must be a point where there aren't any horizons to move to, that suddenly the populations have filled up around you. And
that's what I mean.
That would be that. But it's worth saying that Curtis Marion, who's a major archaeologist of the Middle Stone Age, some of those sites, Pinnacle Point with ochre, the Cape Coast, which is of course rich with resources, and he makes arguments that all the complexity of symbolic culture, of human symbolic culture, arose at that stage. He's looking at that date, 160, because it's intergroup warfare and competition. And this would have been what produced morality. Would you believe it? Intergroup warfare produces sexual morality. Yeah, his argument is supposed to be it's part of it's an archaeologically embedded argument of the so-called bellicose school. So it's part of that sort of Wrangham tendency in that. The idea that warfare sets us off on our symbolic career is like, yeah, it's very embedded, and it comes out of this lethal weaponry equalizing business is where it comes.
Perhaps we're stressing that, I mean, maybe a bit of a simplification to say this, but that the only alternative to Camilla's playful gender warfare model is warfare between bunches of men. That's
well, what was Jerome's formulation the other day? If you have men trying to stop other men being violent, you're just going to have male gang warfare. You obviously need to undercut it by women. I can't. He had this beautiful formulation the other day, and we need to transcribe it.
If one bunch of men just overthrow
another, you just get another bunch of men.
In order to make a permanent, real revolutionary change, the women are going to take over. And Jerome's,
it's evident.
He just puts it beautifully.
Yeah, it's so evident.
Thanks.
Who else would like? What about the room? Any more questions? You need to repeat your questions. No? Anybody cross on behalf of graeber and wengrow? Nobody here is a spy for wengrow.
I mean, everybody that knows about hunter-gatherers, if you're talking about the ideology of hunter-gatherers, it's the ideology of blood. It's all about the blood of the hunt, the blood of women. It's all about the taboos around blood.
Well, exactly what Ivan said with the Batek. It applies exactly with the Hadza, and it applies with Bayaka.
The whole book, which never mentions menstruation at all. When for hunter-gatherers, it's kind of the main thing. It's the main thing.
We haven't got Ian here, have we?
The thing that everyone's concerned about. The thing called menstrual blood. I mean, in the West, we still respect these absurd taboos I'm talking about.
Well, it's an interesting thing that when they're talking about, there's passages when they're talking about Knossos, ancient Minoan Crete, where they notice, Ian, you know about this, don't you? Where they notice that there are lustral basins for priestesses to do washing at the time of which they associate to menstruation. Suddenly, they're quite happy to talk about menstruation when it's some complex urban society. But if it's hunter-gatherers, no, that's primitive. Don't.
Yeah.
Very strange. Do you want to say any more of that?
Not really, because I mean, I missed the beginning, but basically they do their best to ignore immediate return hunter-gatherers as a category altogether. I mean, and they kind of misuse woodburn, but kind of woodburn also made it possible for them to just represent the Hadza. So it's a sort of vicious circle there.
Yep, they do all kinds of tricks there. Yeah, it's hard to understand. I mean, on a bigger sort of question, it's hard to understand why exactly would a couple of very lefty, very authoritative professors who could make the arguments that egalitarianism is really human nature, why do they want to rubbish it? Why do they want to say, no, these hunter-gatherers were just as much hierarchical as they were? Because that's what makes them complex and interesting. Even though actually egalitarianism is more complex cognitively, why don't they want to take on board that? They use woodburn in a way that makes out the only human beings who can be egalitarian live in these very primitive immediate return societies, is how they use woodburn. And therefore, us lot here in big cities, there's no hope for us. And yet, if our nature is egalitarian, why is there no hope for us? There is obviously hope. From the room.
I find that hunter-gatherers get it from all angles. Because they get it from the far right, and they get it from colonial types who are saying these are the most primitive, savage peoples around.
Yeah.
It's really ironic, and I think among the anthropological community we have a problem with constantly being scared of people saying we're romanticizing indigenous people the entire time. It's a massive fear. And the have. And what they do is they give ground to the far right and to their people, and like pop out for people like Jared Diamond and
absolutely Hinker, whatever.
And they're just like, we're not
Yeah.
Don't, right, yes, yes, yeah, yeah. It does.
And immediate hunter-gatherers especially are already so oppressed. They're going through so much anyway. It's
Yeah.
ironic that academics in the
Yeah.
West are kind of
Yeah,
also not appreciating their
Yeah.
incredible life.
yeah.
Very good point.
Yeah, it's really, really good point. I've got Mark in the room. Are there any women want to speak, or anybody who's not yet spoken want to speak? We'll go with Mark and then try and invite some others.
Well, I think there's another layer to this, which is like David Graeber, who is much missed. Anyone involved in radical politics in London over the past decade would know that, unlike so many other academics, he was absolutely stalwart again and again and again to commit to supporting and encouraging activism like almost no one else. He's sorely missed. Whatever political differences I, for instance, had with him, really irrelevant compared to that amazing record. But I think this is why, yes, in terms of anthropology, in terms of what Marshall Sahlins, Graeber's teacher, was interested in, there are lots of explanations, but why David made this basic error of not taking hunter-gatherer research seriously enough. But fundamentally, it's something else. I think it's, if you look back at the radical left over the past century, many years ago, before those were here, history was on our side. It looked like the working class were asserting themselves through social democratic movements in the West and through more radical, apparently, movements across the rest of the planet. Half the planet, at some stages of the middle of the 20th century, were run by regimes that claimed to be communist. It looked like, despite all the problems, things were going in our direction. History was objectively going in our direction. It was our job just to push it the right way, perhaps. That's not how anyone is looking at it now. It looks that history is going in exactly the wrong direction. Human civilization, maybe human existence, it's going to be wiped out in the next century. We're inevitably horror story, the nightmare of climate change, in the new report that came out just today. I think freezing temperature past year.
It's going to be 1.5 very soon.
Any idea that history is objectively material going in our direction, we just have to push a bit further. It's off again entirely. So I can see why David and many others who love the book, and it's a great book in many respects, are really attracted to the idea that what makes us different, what makes you special, is we just choose. We can choose hierarchy, we can choose egalitarianism. It's all about freedom of choice, and go back to what I would consider a very crude liberal or anarchist idea of how history is. But as David and the two Davids say in the book, they paraphrase Marx. I mean, we do make history, humans do make history, but not in circumstances of our own choosing. And if we just forget about all that materialist stuff as well, it's end up making a feel-good story. It explains and understands nothing. Now, why David and David went in that direction, it makes sense in this present period, but I don't think it makes sense.
No, it doesn't. No one in, come back. No one in the room. Is that Eleanor or is that Ian? What? And then we'll have Manchego, and I'm looking at the Zoom. So, Eleanor, or is it Ian? And then Manchego. Oh, how are we doing? We'll just have another 5 or 10 minutes. Ian, I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. Is that right? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. It's simply the other big omission, which of course you've covered, is that it's not just that neither of them are familiar with evolutionary science, it's that there is a long history of an antipathy there. So that there is. Graeber, the fact that Graeber was Sahlins' student, and Sahlins was at the forefront of that battle in the 70s between all
selfish gene biologists,
woke thinking progressives saying, oh, how dare these popularizers of sociobiology encroach upon symbolic culture. Of course, they had a point, but they approached it arse backwards, you know, trying to use politics to evaluate the science rather than the other way around. And Graeber and wengrow, but Graeber especially, has fallen hook, line, and sinker for that. He hasn't been too lazy to challenge his own prejudices.
Yeah, that's true. But he was a classic US cultural anthropologist in his attitude towards evolutionary theory. Absolutely.
I mean, Graeber seriously recommends that we all forget about Darwin altogether, and everything that's come out of Darwinism, and go back to Kropotkin.
He wants to use Kropotkin.
Kropotkin does have a one-size-fits-all model, which is that mutual aid is everywhere, whereas of course you get.
So you can't explain anything about increasing cooperation or decreasing cooperation because you've just got mutual aid everywhere anyway.
You need conflict.
So, yeah.
And solutions to conflict.
That doesn't help.
Which is what Darwinism does. Looks at both sides of the coin.
Mm.
Whereas Kropotkinism doesn't. It just got a rosy view of mutual aid all over the place without explaining it.
There are a couple of people in the Zoom I'd like to pull out. Mark Pizzato saying, as I recall, or are you there, Mark? Can you speak about this? As I recall from the Dawn of Everything, they find evidence for competitive play, farming, and politics than for egalitarian origins. Is that because competitive male warrior groups built settlements, worship structures that left more of the early evidence? I think there's just a built-in bias by archaeologists that impressive structures impress archaeologists. They just like, you know, it's a bit like big penises, really. And yeah, so yes, I bet that's some of it. And you're extrapolating. I contest this with you though, Mark. When I'm talking about the universal features of humans, I'm not extrapolating from hunter-gatherer culture. I'm talking about all human beings. All of us have bodies, hearts, minds, and souls that wouldn't be here without egalitarianism in the past. So I'm not just saying, you know, just hunter-gatherers. And then Evan, you have something interesting here saying, G&W suggests the story of egalitarian origins is depressing and gives ideological ammunition to hierarchical arrangements. Presumably this is because they believe this would mean cultures like modern ones with high population densities, complex divisions of labor might not be so conducive to egalitarian arrangements. Yes, I agree that that's what they try to say. Rather than challenge these fundamental aspects of modernity, they choose to tell a different story that conflates everything to playful cultural choice. Yes, I think that's a good summation. Yes, very good. Did anybody else? I'll come back to Manchego and maybe you can wrap up, but is anyone who would like a wrap-up question? I've got John here and Jamie here, James Van Lenen and John here, if anybody want to say anything. Oh, Jamie, yeah, you say you want to comment. Why don't you say something? You got to unmute though. James.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something really important with Dawn of Everything regarding gender, which is their assertion that agriculture is a product of a woman's rebellion against, from my interpretation, the way they frame it, complex hunter-gatherers of the PPNA, PPNB, Göbekli Tepe time frame. So that all of that begs a really important analysis. Whether that's true or not, but I do think that we should not neglect resource intensified hunter-gatherers in these dynamics. I don't think that women rebelled against them and started agriculture because of that. I think it's way more complicated. But anyways, just since RAG is very focused on gender issues, I think that that aspect needs to be highlighted more and discussed more.
Yep. Thanks, James. Yep. I completely agree with that. So right. John, did you have a question? I'll come back to Manchego, and I had to answer somebody there. John, Manchego, if you want to go, and John can come in if he wants at the end.
I just wanted to point out that At Göbekli Tepe, the guy who found it, Klaus Schmidt of blessed memory, he said that it's potentially about 15,000 years is the length there, but they have
Göbekli Tepe. Is that what you're talking about?
Göbekli
Right,
Tepe.
yeah.
Confirmed
Okay.
right now
Yeah.
is around the time of the Younger Dryas, which is
Yeah,
maybe
it's 11,000, yeah.
yeah.
Sure, thanks for clearing that up. Just to say to questions on the Zoom, a couple of you have taken recordings, which is great. We're happy if you want to spread our stuff around. And some saying they can make an automatic transcription. That would be great. I'm not sure we're capable of doing that. We will put a recording on our Vimeo collection, which will be available for anyone who wants to check it out. And I'll post that on social media, for those links on social media, for anybody who's up on Mastodon or Fediverse or even Twitter still, or Facebook at the moment, and our website. Thank you. Have we finished? Everybody had enough? Oh, we've got another question at the back.
That's the last one.
Good, yeah. Well, wengrow has been in this room to talk with Graeber. We have invited him ever since Graeber, we sadly lost David Graeber. We have invited him. He's claimed childcare responsibilities on Tuesdays, and that he couldn't, so we couldn't argue with that. I'm not sure whether he really has time for riffraff like us, to put it bluntly. I didn't want that to be recorded, but okay. You better cut that one out. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody who struggled to make it here through the dangerous terrain of the Institute of Archaeology. And thank you very much for the fantastic Zoom audience. We're really glad you're here. And yeah, hope we'll see. Next week, because this term usually has a lot of attention to mythology, we have our very own Chris Knight talking about the bird nester story, which is really for Levi-Strauss like the original basic key myth of all mythology.
3-volume work by Claude Levi-Strauss on North and South American myth.
So he's going to be decoding or looking into that decode for us, and that's fantastic. So come back and join us on Zoom. I hope we'll be able to bring a lot more people to UCL.
They need to come early and to come through the archaeology department if they want to come into the building.
Yeah, thank you. So the next couple of weeks.
2 months is what they're saying.
Oh no. So we very much want to have people here live at UCL, but you will have to come in through the Institute of Archaeology. We will have to devise ways of conducting people through the door, because it's a bit of a computer game thing of crossing enemy terrain. But okay, I'm sure we'll get used to it. I'm sure we'll suss it out. But please do come back to UCL. We have some fantastic talks coming up, especially Jerome, but Denise Solali in February. We have Cedric Burks, we have Morna Finnegan, and lots of brilliant talks later in the term. But we've got good talks ourselves here now. Okay, so see you later. I'm going to end this off, and goodbye. See you hopefully next week. Bye then.
Bye. Thank you.